Oh, it's gone. Huh. Hello, everyone. This is Eric Michael from Life Entertainment, Learning Instructions for Empowerment. And today we're going to go over the truth about the Democratic Party, its history, and why I believe it's lining up to just more oppression and how their history aligns with the oppression of people in general, especially when it comes to different colors or races of people. So the Democratic Party was originally founded in 1972. It was founded by Thomas Jefferson, I believe, but it was called the Democratic Republic Party. That was the original name for it. And then in 1824 came the new modern Democratic Party. That's when it emerged in 1824, and it was built by Martin Van Buren. And this is when the Democrats was for expansion and taking over new territories. So originally their thought and process was that it was okay to go and overtake what we now know as the United States. They were for that, and the Whig Party, which was their counterparts, was against it. And because of this expansion of party, they were for the war on Native Americans, pushing Native Americans out. The Democrats were for this. They thought this was okay, and this is where you see them expand to the South, and where you see the expansion of slavery in the South, because they took all this land and they saw it was good for farming. And the Democrats were the party who was originally for slavery. If you look at it, the Democratic states were the ones who owned slaves. By the way, the Democratic Party is the oldest party that is still standing. There's been other parties, but like the Whig Party, but most of them are no longer in existence, and the Democratic Party is still going strong since pretty much the beginning and the birth of our nation. So yeah, and this was the Democrats' look on slavery. They believed that it was a state-to-state thing, that it should be something that is regulated by the state. So in other words, it was a state law instead of a national law. And so they wasn't for interfering in with the states who had slavery, which in the end, the southern states, all the way until around the 1960s, which we'll talk about later, was a Democratic Party. They were all majority Democrat parties. Robert E. Lee and all these southern states were originally Democrats Party, and they were for slavery. The Republican Party wasn't founded until March 20th, 1854, and we saw this with the emergence of Abraham Lincoln, who originally, when he ran as president, was the National Union Party, which was a temporary name that eventually turned to the Republican Party as we know it today. So the Republican Party wasn't until Abraham Lincoln in it. So it's a relatively new party compared to the Democratic Party, and this is where you see this is where you see slavery come to an end. And then his successor, Ulysses S. Grant, who pretty much won the Civil War all by himself. There is only one major battle, which is Gettysburg, that he cannot hold account for as his victory. All other major victories that the Union won was by him. He ran as a Republican, and even though growing up, I believe it was his father and even his father-in-law, they owned slaves, he was never for slaves. He even freed a couple of slaves that was given to him before he left for the war, because he was totally against it. He didn't feel like it was morally right. And then when he became president, he was the first one who actually pushed for civil rights. He was the one who was trying to push for equality, for black people to be able to vote and to have land and to live free. And during that time period, there was a lot of terrorism, if you will, going amongst them, and mainly the southern states between South Carolina, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and all these other southern states. And Ulysses S. Grant eventually declared martial law, and it calmed down, and then he pulled out, and then it happened again, but the Congress would not allow him to do it again, and so he pretty much had his hands tied behind his back. But he was the original president who was for civil rights, in the movement. And guess what? He was a Republican, guys. That's right. He also was the one who enforced the Ku Klux Klan Act. This is when they became very popular, and they were doing a lot of stuff in South Carolina, and that's when you have the trials of South Carolina, and that's what it was about, the Ku Klux Klan. And that's essentially what made it all die down, because he marked them as a terrorist organization, as unconstitutional. He also, in 1870, is the one who incorporated the Department of Justice. Now, I find that interesting because it was the Republicans who formed the Department of Justice, which has to deal with law and order. And now we're in a time and era where we're seeing the Democrats saying defund the police and all this other nonsense. And we're seeing anarchy, but it's the Republicans who are like, no, we need to increase some funding in police. We need our police. They're for law and order. I just find that interesting. So anyways, the Democrats held the South until the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And originally, JFK was the one who presented this to Congress before his assassination. And then after his assassination, his vice president, who became president, Lyndon B. Johnson, saw it through and had it passed in 1964. Now, the reason why this is important is because JFK was a Democrat, but he was back then there was Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. And there's a reason why this is important. JFK, he was from Massachusetts, so he was a Northern Democrat. Lyndon B. Johnson was from Texas, so he was a Southern Democrat. And the reason why this is all interesting, crazy, because there's long been this theory and conspiracy that JFK was an inside assassination, that it was the CIA, that Lyndon B. Johnson might have been around it because Johnson wanted to be president. He did not want to be vice president at all. And to keep Johnson happy, JFK kept him in on everything. And that was just to keep him appeased and happy. Otherwise, Johnson would create problems in the media. And JFK knew this. Kennedy knew this. Well, then you have his assassination, and Johnson becomes president. But he still passes the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and then in 1965, he had the War on Poverty, where he puts in Medicare and Medicaid. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because he did it mainly for his votes. Like, he wanted the votes of the black people. He knew that was how he could stay in presidency. But segregation was largely held up by the Southern Democrats. The Southern Democrats was for segregation, and the Northern Democrats, while they opposed it, they allowed it to happen as long as the Southern Democrats had their back in all their other policies. That was their agreement. That was known to be their agreement. So even though the Northern Democrats opposed it, I still find that they were guilty, because it's just like in any other legal case. If you know about something, you're still considered guilty because you knew about it and you don't do nothing about it. And that's how I feel about the Northern Democrat Party all the way up until the 60s, where you see JFK, he came in and he said, no, enough's enough. And the Republicans and the Northern Democrats were both for the Civil Rights Act. And so that's important to know in history. And then around this time, at the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s, is when you see the shift of the South becoming Republicans. This is where the Republicans put all their focus in the southern states and turning them into a Republican state. And since the 70s, as far as I can tell, most southern states like Texas and Florida and all these others have been Republican ever since. And this is where you see the cultural shift and cultural change, where you see segregation end, Civil Rights Act, the War on Poverty, and all these other things. And you see this focus change. And the Democrats become more of a northern hemisphere, and the southern states become more of a Republican party. And so that was interesting. And because you see, even nowadays, you see, well, how come do the black people not vote for Republicans so much? And they're like, well, we just don't see them. And I think that was majorly their fault. And this was the reason why they wanted to win the South, and they did in the end. And so, all this is to say that the Democrats have always been about oppression, one way or another. Like Medicare and Medicaid, it looks good on paper. It's one of those things that looks good on paper, but in the end, it is. There's still a lot of poverty. It's even worse. Families are more broken up now than ever, and a lot of people connected to this. And the reason why I say the Democrats are for oppression is because now they're trying to push socialism and a socialistic economy, which will be into my next video as to why all this is wrong and why they're about oppression. I believe these people are about oppression. They want to oppress you. They don't want you to rise up. They don't want you to be free. This is a party that's been going on since the 1700s, since the founding of our nation, and it's probably a tradition that's been passed down through generations, because that's how things like this are. There's traditions that's passed down from generation to generation to generation. Yes, they might have changed with the times, and they say they're for your freedom. And I'm not saying that they're racist, but it doesn't mean they're not for the oppression of people in general. It doesn't matter what your race is. So that's why this is an important election year in general. I believe that we do not need the Democrats in the White House. It's not saying the Republicans are that great. There's issues on both sides. We see the biggest divide ever in our country. I believe we're going to see a rise of a new party. When instances like this happen in our nation, we see a rise of a new political party, and we're already seeing that, and it's mainly backed up from QAnon. QAnon is pushing these people who aren't even politics. Trump was the first non-political person to become president. We're going to see a trend of this. I believe it's going to emerge a new political party, and I think it'll be good for our country. But we'll see how it goes, guys. If you like the video, like, subscribe, and just do your research and keep up the faith in our country, guys.